He had 43 cameras watching her every move and he still almost missed the truth. A millionaire CEO, twin deaf sons and a maid who showed up every night at midnight, moving her hands over his sleeping children in the dark. Gibson Hulk had already fired 3 women for failing his boys. He wasn't about to trust a fourth. So he watched every single night, from hotel rooms in Dubai, Singapore, Tokyo. He pulled up the footage and he watched, and what he saw made him more suspicious, not less. But here's the thing about watching someone through a camera: you see everything they do, and nothing of why they do it. The night the truth finally hit him, he wasn't even looking at a screen. He was standing in a hallway, listening to a sound he hadn't heard since his wife died. His son was laughing, and the woman he had spent 7 weeks building a case against was on the nursery floor, crying tears of joy over a miracle she had quietly been building, one small hand gesture at a time. This is the story of what the cameras almost made him miss. And what grace looked like when nobody was supposed to be paying attention. Welcome to Kindness Arena. If you believe in kindness, second chances and unseen connections that change lives, please help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers. Help me show her that stories like this matter and deserve to be heard by hitting the subscribe button, liking the video, comment your thoughts, where you are watching from, and share it with someone who needs it to stay motivated. Your support keeps these powerful true stories alive. The Hulk estate sat at the crest of Meridian Hill like a crown no one had asked for. 42 rooms. A staff of 11. 3 luxury vehicles that Gibson Hulk rarely drove because he was always on a plane, always in a boardroom, always somewhere that wasn't home. He had built Hulk Tech from a basement operation into a billion-dollar empire in just under a decade. Forbes had called him relentless. Time magazine had called him visionary. His late wife, Amira, had simply called him mine, and that had always been enough. Amira died on a Tuesday. 6 months after giving birth to their twin boys, Eli and Ethan, a postpartum complication that the doctors called rare and Gibson called unbearable. She never got to hear them laugh. She never got to watch them crawl. She went into the hospital for a routine check and she did not come back out. From that day forward, Gibson Hulk became 2 men. One was the CEO, composed, ruthless, calculating. The other was a father, terrified, hollowed out, and entirely alone. The boys were diagnosed at 4 months old. Congenital bilateral sensory neural hearing loss. Profound. Both of them. The doctors explained it gently, with diagrams and statistics and pamphlets about early intervention. Gibson sat in the consultation room and heard every word, and felt none of it. His sons would never hear music. They would never hear rain. They would never hear him say their names. He wept for 3 days. Then he got back to work, because that was the only thing he knew how to do. What he could not do, what his schedule and his grief would not permit, was raise Eli and Ethan himself, not properly, not the way Amira would have. So he hired help, good help, he thought. Expensive help. The first maid, Mrs. Benson, lasted 6 weeks. Gibson came home early from a Tokyo conference and found the boys sitting in soiled nappies in front of a blaring television, having been ignored for what the security logs would later confirm was nearly 4 hours. She was dismissed that evening. The second, a woman named Portia who had come with glowing references, lasted 11 days. The cameras caught her leaving Ethan's bedroom door wide open during a nap while she made hour-long personal phone calls on the garden patio. One afternoon, little Ethan had crawled to the top of the stairs. Gibson reviewed the footage that night, and he could not sleep for a week. The third left of her own accord, citing the emotional pressure of the household. By the time Gibson posted the vacancy for the 4th time, something had changed in him. He stopped looking for warmth. He started looking for surveillance. He had the estate's camera system upgraded, 43 high-definition cameras covering every room, every hallway, every corner of the property except the bathrooms. He hired a security firm to monitor the feeds in real time. He reviewed footage personally every evening, no matter where in the world he was. He became a man who loved his sons through a screen. Clare Jones arrived on a grey Wednesday morning in February. She was 33 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped dark hair and the unhurried movements of someone who had long since stopped performing urgency for other people's comfort. She had spent 10 years working in a specialist care home for children with hearing and developmental disabilities. She held certifications in British Sign Language and ASL. She came with one reference letter, handwritten, 3 pages long, from the director of the care home she had left to return to private work. Gibson read the letter twice. Then he had his assistant run a background check. Then he reviewed the check again personally. Then he hired her, but he did not trust her. He was cordial at her orientation, clinical during their briefing. He walked her through the estate, introduced her to Eli and Ethan, who stared up at her with Amira's enormous dark eyes, and then he pulled up the camera monitoring app on his phone. "I want to be transparent with you," he said. "Every room in this house is monitored. I review the footage daily." Claire looked at him, not defensively, not with the brittle smile of someone trying to pass a test. She simply nodded and said, "Good. You should be able to see your boys whenever you want." Something about the answer unsettled him. Not because it was wrong, but because it was exactly right, and she had said it as though she actually meant it for his sake rather than to impress him. He flew to Singapore the next morning. For the first 2 weeks, Gibson found nothing to criticize. Claire fed Eli and Ethan on schedule. She changed them promptly. She took them into the garden when the weather permitted. She read to them, which Gibson found strange and slightly wasteful, given that the boys were deaf and could not hear a word, but she did it every morning, holding the books up so they could see the pictures, pointing at each image, her face animated and expressive. He noted it, filed it under harmless eccentricity, but then, in the 3rd week, something changed. Gibson was in Dubai reviewing footage from the previous night, and he noticed something that stopped him cold. Claire was in the nursery at 11:47 p.m. She should have been in her room. The boys were asleep. There was no reason for her to be there. She was kneeling beside Eli's cot. Her hands were moving. Gibson leaned forward. In the green-tinted night vision of the camera, he watched her hands move slowly, deliberately, over the sleeping child. Her lips were also moving slightly. She was there for 4 minutes and 32 seconds. Then she rose, checked on Ethan, and quietly left. Gibson called his security firm that night. "I need the audio enhanced from the nursery footage. Nursery camera 4, timestamp 11:47. The technician called back an hour later. "Mr. Hulk, the audio is clear but there isn't much on it. The room's quiet. The only sound is the maid. She appears to be praying, sir." Gibson sat with that for a long moment. "Praying?" "Yes, sir." Quietly. Under her breath. He did not fire her, but he watched harder. Every evening, he pulled up the feeds. He began cataloging the things he saw as evidence of something, though he could not name what. Claire sang, singing to boys who could not hear, swaying them gently during nappy changes, making them laugh with elaborate facial expressions and silly, exaggerated gestures. Spending an extra 40 minutes with Ethan one afternoon when the boy was inconsolably distressed, rocking him with a patience that Gibson found almost aggressive in its steadiness. She was not neglecting them. He could see that clearly. But the nightly visits bothered him. 3 weeks in, 4 weeks in. Always between 11 and midnight. Always the same slow, deliberate hand movements over the sleeping children. He wanted to ask her, but asking meant admitting he had been watching specifically for fault, and somehow that felt like a confession he was not ready to make. In the 7th week, something happened that Gibson Hulk would describe, in the rare interviews he gave about his personal life in the years that followed, as the moment everything rearranged itself. He was home, actually home, not traveling, eating dinner alone in the vast dining room when he heard it. A sound from the nursery, not crying, not the usual background noise of the baby monitor. Something else entirely. Something he had not heard in this house in a very long time. Laughter. He set down his fork and walked upstairs. He stood in the hallway outside the nursery door, which was slightly ajar, and he looked through the gap. Claire was on the floor with both boys, who were now 8 months old and sitting up with the wobbling, determined balance of babies discovering gravity. She had her hands in the air, and she was making a shape, fingers spread, then curling, then tapping her chest, and both Eli and Ethan were watching her hands with an intensity that stopped Gibson's breath. Then Ethan did it. Slowly, imprecisely, with the fumbling concentration of a baby learning that his hands could mean something, Ethan raised his arms and made the shape. Claire's face broke open. She clapped once, pulled him into a hug so fierce that Ethan squawked with surprised delight, and then she pulled back, tears running openly down her face, and she made the shape again. Gibson stood in the hallway and understood, in a single, crashing wave, what he had been watching for weeks on his screen without knowing how to see it. She had been teaching them sign language. Every morning reading session, she had been pointing at pictures and signing the words. Every song she sang, she had been signing the lyrics simultaneously. Every naptime visit, every hand movement over the sleeping children, she had been practicing the signs she would teach them the next day, committing them to muscle memory so she could give his sons what she believed they deserved, a way to speak. A language that belonged to them. And at night, when the boys were asleep and the house was quiet, she had been kneeling beside their cots and praying over them by name. Not for a miracle. He would learn later, when he finally asked her, that she had never once prayed for God to give them their hearing back. She had prayed for them to know they were loved. She had prayed that they would grow up whole. She had prayed that their father would one day find his way back to them. Gibson pushed open the nursery door. Claire looked up, unsurprised. She gently settled Eli against the foam cushion beside her, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and met his eyes without flinching. "Ethan just signed Mama for the first time," she said. Her voice was steady, but barely. "He's been working on it for 2 weeks. I didn't want to tell you until he got it right. I thought you should see it." Gibson Hulk had not cried in front of another person since the day Amira died. He sat down on the nursery floor in his $3,000 suit. Eli immediately crawled toward him, grabbed a fistful of his shirt, and pulled himself upright with the triumphant gravity of a summit conquered. Ethan looked at his father with Amira's eyes, raised his small hands, and made the sign again. "Mama." Gibson covered his face with both hands, and Clare Jones, the woman he had spent 7 weeks watching for failure, put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing at all because she had, by now, spent 7 weeks learning exactly what this family needed, and she knew it was not words. In the years that followed, Gibson reduced his travel schedule by 60%. He hired a deaf education specialist who worked alongside Claire 3 days a week. He learned sign language himself, badly at first, then fluently, then with the particular ease of a man who had finally found something worth being good at. Eli and Ethan grew up bilingual, in sign, and in speech, because they both opted for cochlear implants at age 3, a decision Gibson made sure was always going to be theirs. They were, by every account of those who knew them, the most communicative children anyone had ever met. Clare Jones stayed with the Hulk family for 11 years, until she retired. At her farewell dinner, a proper one, in the dining room that had once been too large and too quiet, Eli stood up, all of 11 years old, and delivered a speech in sign language while Ethan interpreted it aloud. He said that Claire had taught them that love was not something you waited to show when everything was safe. It was something you gave in advance. It was something you practiced in the dark, when nobody was watching. Gibson Hulk, sitting at the head of the table, glanced up at the camera in the corner of the room. He smiled. Then he looked back at his boys. Sometimes the lens shows us what we look for. And sometimes, if we are very fortunate, it shows us what was always there. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that kindness is never wasted and that even a broken path can lead to beautiful places and change of lives, please like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Kindness Arena because your support keeps stories like this alive and spreading. Tell us in the comment what you would have done differently if you were the Hulk Gibson. Would you have fired her after seeing the footage? Or has a stranger's kindness ever changed your life in ways you didn't expect? Would love to hear your story.